Thank you to all for joining us today. This is something that is of the utmost importance to the Yurok Tribe, and I appreciate you spending your time with us, and I'm hoping that we can share our message of speaking for the salmon through the work that we all do together as a result of this press conference. So as Craig mentioned, I am a tribal member. My family is from the mouth of the river, from the village of Rekwa, and for generations, my family, along with other Yurok families, have lived and fished and been on the Klamath River. And in fact, since time immemorial, we have practiced a fishing way of life. We were never relocated. We've always been on the Klamath River, and what that means for us is that we continue our fishing way of life. And so this year, with the fisheries failure, we know that our river is sick, and we know that if we don't take specific actions to heal the river, that things aren't going to restore on their own. The Yurok Tribe is looking at a fisheries allocation of about 650 fish, which is the lowest allocation that we've ever received. Just for context, it's 650 fish is about 10% of the second lowest fish allocation that we've ever received, which was last year. Last year we got it was just under 6,000 fish, and that was the second lowest we've ever gotten. And now here we are for next year looking at 650 fish. And so the people in the community are devastated. People are coming to our offices, to the tribal government office in shock. There's a lot of tears. There's a lot of questions about how am I going to feed my family? How am I going to keep my lights on? People are in distress. And so what I want to focus my remarks on today are some of the cultural effects, to talk about that more, and then also the economic effects, and then talk about the tribe's vision for how we fix this. So as I mentioned, we've been on the river for time immemorial. And so what that means for us even today is that most of what we do as tribal people revolves around fish in some way. So even when the fish aren't running, we are prepping our gear, we are talking about fishing, we are eating our canned salmon. As the season gets closer, we are buying new gear, we're making plans to make sure we can be on the river when the fish come home. And then when the fish arrive, we all gather down at the mouth of the Klamath River to be there together and to harvest. And that's a great time of community. It's a great time of being together and working together and having a very strong sense of pride that we as Yurok people are continuing our traditions that we have exercised since time immemorial. And then when the fish leave, we are back home smoking and canning our fish and talking about the great times that we had. So I explain all of that to set up that this year none of that is going to happen. So that great sense of community will be absent. That great sense of gathering around the fish, around the salmon run, will not be there. And for us, what that means is our very social fabric is falling apart. And we are a community, unfortunately, that already suffers from very high unemployment rates, very high poverty rates. About 80% of the reservation residents live below the poverty line. Lots of our reservation homes don't even have electricity yet. So we struggle with drug and alcohol problems. And when you take away the very core of our social fabric, which is salmon, those problems are just going to be exacerbated. And so this is, it's a social justice issue for us, but it's also just a survival issue. And we're literally talking about trying to preserve our historic way of life. And without the salmon, we can't do that. From an economic perspective, the tribe operates a commercial fishery, and our tribal government and our tribal citizenry is very committed to making sure that our tribal harvest is sustainable. We have a cultural, I always call it a cultural covenant, that requires us to never take more from the Klamath River than what is sustainable. And that's, living by that cultural covenant has allowed us to continue our salmon way of life since time immemorial. But for us this year, because we won't have enough fish to sustainably harvest in a commercial fashion, we're not going to have a commercial fishery. So our commercial fisheries is canceled, and that means that we won't have that income that we rely upon every year, just like the offshore commercial fishermen, to support our families. And again, I mentioned some of the issues around poverty on the reservation, lack of economic opportunities. So when you take away the commercial fishery, that means our people are literally left with nothing. They're left with no other options. A good sort of analogy is, closing the fishery for us is the same as closing, some kind of plant in a one-plant kind of town. So this is going to be really hard for us. It's going to have a lot of repercussions. The tribal government is working very diligently to try to figure out how to help our tribal members through this difficult time. One thing I also want to mention is in addition to the economic issues, we understand, as Noah said, why we're in this position. On the Klamath River, you have basically almost 200 years of development and consumptive uses of water. There are 6 dams on the Klamath River. There are dams on the Trinity River, which is a major tributary to the Klamath. The last dams on both of the rivers were built, right in the 1960s, and those dams were built without fish ladders. And so now here we are, almost 50 years later, and our salmon are resilient, but there's only so much they can take. The dams cause poor water quality. They allow for toxic blue-green algae blooms, which kill our salmon. They create good river conditions. Well, I wouldn't say they create river conditions that allow for diseases, parasites to spread. And so they generally just create really bad water conditions. And so that's why, let me step back. We know that in 2014 and 2015, those river conditions led to the spread of a fish disease called C. shasta, and that killed about 80 to 90% of our baby salmon. So even though we didn't have a massive fish kill like we did in 2003 of adult Chinook and coho salmon, we still continue to have fish kills on the Klamath River. And we know that the kills that happened in 2014 and 2015, those are the runs that are starting to come back now, and that's why we're seeing such low numbers return. And so we're doing things about that. We're working with our neighbors. As Noah mentioned, there's an agreement to remove the 4 lower Klamath River dams. We stand next to Pacificor in its business decision to remove the dams from the Klamath River. We're confident that that's going to happen by 2020. And we know that through these kinds of agreements, working with our neighbors and our partners, that we will fix and we will heal the Klamath River. The Yurok people have always lived on the Klamath. We will always live on the Klamath River. We will always fight for our salmon. And in part because we know, because we've been there so long, we've seen things come and go, we've seen things change, and we know that this will pass as long as the people of the river decide that it's time to heal it and that it's time to change it. And so I totally agree with the comments that Noah made, that what our river needs is an update to its operating system. We need to remove the dams. We need to evaluate how Water releases are made, the water flow regimes. We need to do some water quality improvement work. We need to do some habitat restoration. And that's all work that we as a community from the lower basin to the upper basin can unite together and figure out how to update the operating system on the Klamath River to make our lifeways sustainable. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.